Let's talk next to Sir Laurie Bristow, the former British ambassador to Russia. Sir Laurie, thank you very much for joining us. I guess the big question mark hanging over these peace talks, so-called, in Jeddah, is whether there is any real pressure on President Putin at all from the Americans. What's your instinct? What do you think?
Yeah. Well, certainly, I would hope that Steve Witkoff's comments are to be taken solely as his idea of diplomatic politeness, and that there is no misunderstanding around Mr. Trump about what exactly they're dealing with. I mean, of course, Mr. Putin is seeking to manipulate these negotiations, and I think it's very much to be tested whether Mr. Putin wants a ceasefire of any sort at all. I mean, it's probably the case that the Americans are looking for a ceasefire probably by Easter, so the middle of April. And as you'll recall, there have been several attempts over the last few weeks to get there. So Mr. Zelensky agreed to a full 30-day ceasefire. The Russians turned that down. There was agreement in principle last week to a partial ceasefire, again, differing views as to what exactly that covered, but it seems to be energy infrastructure. And the discussions today are reported to be about the Black Sea shipping arrangements. I mean, one of the points here is that we have been here before with the Black Sea, and you can see how it would be clearly in each side's interests to find some sort of arrangement for a ceasefire there. We need to be clear about what Russia's been doing. From the start of the war, Russia has been seeking to control all of Ukraine's Black Sea ports and coastline, and in doing so to strangle Ukraine's exports of grain and of fertilizer. I really don't see that objective changing, even though Ukraine has successfully turned the tables on the Russians by sinking parts of the Russian Black Sea fleet.
When it comes to Britain's role in all of this, the coalition of the willing is meant to be there for a peace deal. Once a peace deal has been agreed, to help, as it were, police and guarantee that deal. And yet the Kremlin keeps saying that under no circumstances would they sign any peace deal which allowed Western troops into Ukraine. So from a sort of naive perspective, it's hard to see what the coalition of the willing is actually for.
Well, there is absolutely no question of the Kremlin under any circumstances ever agreeing to boots on the ground from NATO or NATO countries. That's not really, though, what the heart of this discussion is about. I mean, we need to be very, very clear that there is no prospect of Putin fully and unconditionally and permanently respecting a ceasefire if he ever signs up to one. He will only do that if he is deterred from breaking a ceasefire. I think at the heart of this discussion is about what security guarantees are provided to Ukraine for the foreseeable future when, essentially, Mr. Putin's underlying objectives are not going to change.
And to be clear, John Healey, the Defence Secretary, was reiterating again today that for that to happen, we need to have American involvement in air cover, in intelligence, and frankly, at the backed by American nuclear weapons if necessary. So if the Americans walk away, then it's kind of over for Ukraine. And therefore, I suggest that the big game is whatever we think of Steve Witkoff and whatever people say about President Putin, we have to keep them involved and keep them engaged.
I wouldn't say it was over for Ukraine, and at the present, there isn't a clear sign that the Americans plan simply to walk away. I come back to the point that if we want a ceasefire with Mr. Putin, and I think most normal people would wish the fighting to come to an end, we need to create the conditions where it's clearly more difficult for Russia to continue its aggression against Ukraine than to cease fire. That really depends on full American involvement and commitment, and us working with the Americans to achieve that.
There seems to be a sort of underlying belief in the White House that American economic pressure is the real lever against Russia, should they choose to use it, that they can, increase the quantity of oil and gas that they are producing, drive the price down, and frankly bankrupt the American economy. Do you think that is a realistic view, or do you think that's a kind of classically too business-orientated and simplistic a view of what's going on in Russia?
I think you mean bankrupt the Russian economy. Certainly there should be...
Bankrupt the Russian economy, not their own.
Yeah.
Though they might try to do that too, you never know.
Certainly, there should be a lot more economic pressure on the Russian economy. There's scope for much tighter enforcement of existing sanctions, for bringing in new sanctions, for pushing down hard on the price cap on Russian oil exports. But that in itself will not achieve peace, and it will not achieve what we're looking for in terms of Russia ceasing its aggression against Ukraine. What also needs to happen is a serious and meaningful underwriting of Ukraine's security. Now, there are many ways that could be done. We're not able yet to describe what that looks like. But at the heart of it, the military cost to Russia of continuing its aggression needs to be higher than it is at present, and higher than Russia is prepared to bear. And that depends on Ukraine's Western supporters, the Europeans, the UK, the United States, at least continuing to arm Ukraine so that it's able to defend itself. And if at all possible, reaching some kind of meaningful security guarantee.
Well, it's going to be a big week in the desert. So, Laurie Bristow, thank you very much indeed for talking to LBC.